Hey folks, George here. Today when we discuss philosophy of law, we're going to explore and examine different feminist legal theories. What I really like about this article that we're going to discuss today is that Nancy Levitt and Robert Virchik have really given us a nice summary of at least eight different philosophies or theories that are ultimately within this umbrella of feminist legal theory. Before we get into that though, I think it's important to talk about, when I hear feminism, I hear feminism. But what they're quite brilliant at doing is showing us that there's a lot of different ways and a lot of different perspectives by which we could analyze and explore feminist goals. Yes, feminism seems to spark one idea in some of us. However, there are a lot of different ways and a lot of different disagreements even as to how to best achieve such feminist goals. Yes, some people will hear that at first and say, well, wait, doesn't that show that there's something wrong with feminism? And I'm going to say no. It's in fact the exact opposite. What this shows me, the fact that there are so many different perspectives and so many different insights that we can hear from this feminist perspective, to me shows how fruitful, in fact, the nature of feminism is. Many people are diving in and exploring and examining the nitty-gritty details of what feminism entails. And by the way, this doesn't just happen in philosophy, right? This happens in just about every theory or every aspect of life, doesn't it? You pick any set of beliefs, certainly within religious beliefs. Some people will say, wait, what does it mean to be a Christian? And indeed today we have Christians who disagree about what the most Christian thing to do in some situation might be, and what approach to take towards a certain situation, or even a scope of principles. What are Christian principles? The fact that there are so many different schools of Christianity, so many different denominations rather of Christianity, really illustrate this, right? And to me that actually shows how fruitful some idea is. And by the way, this goes for any religion too. Islam has many different people who disagree about what is the true nature of Islam, or Buddhism, what is the true nature of Buddhism, right? Let me share my perspective on this, these sorts of debates. What I really dislike about these sorts of debates is that sometimes they collapse into something called the no true Scotsman fallacy, right? Now, I don't know much about Scotland or Scotsmen, so I'm from New York. I'll talk about a no true New Yorker fallacy, right? And what the no true New Yorker fallacy will say is, now that I live in New York, and I've lived here for over 20 years, some people will say, oh, no true New Yorker likes the Boston Red Sox baseball team. And then I'll point to my friend, Jerry, and I'll say, look, Jerry, born and raised and lived all his life in New York City. And he likes the Boston Red Sox baseball team. And how will some people respond to that? Oh, yeah, but Jerry's not a true New Yorker. And then I'm at a loss. I call that a fallacy because I'm at a loss to how to even respond to that. It's impossible, in fact, to respond to that because however you're going to argue, some interlocutor will suggest something like, oh, but that's not a true New Yorker. Oh, that's not a true Christian. Or that's not a true Muslim. Or that's not a true Buddhist. Or that's not a true feminist. And I want to refrain myself from making such sorts of claims. Oh, a true feminist would never say this. Right? And I disagree with that because there are a lot of different ways to be a feminist. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of different ways to be a New Yorker. There's a lot of different ways to be a Christian. And different Christians focus on certain principles. Different feminists are going to focus on different principles. So I don't like this notion of no true feminist would say blank. Right? Because in fact, today we have very passionate disagreements, very passionate arguments, very controversial arguments over what feminism might entail. And so I don't want to name call that way. What I do prefer is that we actually engage with the different reasons and arguments and evidences that different flavors or different schools of feminism might put forward. In order to call yourself a feminist, don't you have to have at least some sort of beliefs? And Virchik and Levitt will suggest that there are two principles that really underlie each of these different feminist ideals or these different feminist theories. The first such point that Virchik and Levitt will suggest all feminists agree with is that the world and all of history has been shaped by men. And as such, men today have special powers and special privileges that women do not have. That's one point that they think all feminists will agree with. The second point that they think all feminists will agree with is that women and men should have political, social, and economic equality, right? Now, that I hope the eagle-eyed amongst you will hear that there are more than a couple of controversial terms in that second point, right? I think the first point, that the men have shaped the world, is difficult to rebut. However, the much more controversial idea is, what is this thing called equality, right? And how do we best achieve something called equality? If we do want equality, and many people do like the notion of equality, number one, we have to answer, what does that even mean? What does this thing equality even mean, right? And two, then how do we get it? And so those two sub-questions, what is this thing called equality and how do we get it? Those two sub-questions are where there's a lot of controversy and a lot of disagreement. And I think as we explore 8 different theories of feminism here, we will see how they answer those questions in a slightly different way, each of them, yeah? So with that in mind, let's examine the first feminist theory, and this is going to be called equal treatment feminism, right? Or equal treatment theory, yes? And the theory is ultimately based on the premise that there is a sameness between men and women. Women and men are the same, right? In every way that is important, at least, right? Women and men are the same. For example, they should have the same right to vote. They should have the same freedom of speech. They should have the same job opportunities and opportunities to attend different schools, right? And in those ways, all women and men are the same in all of the relevant and important characteristics that divide men and women, yes? This idea obviously is built on liberal philosophy. By liberal here, let me back up a second, this is George talking now. By liberal philosophy, what we're really talking about is not how American political pundits talk about liberals, right, as meaning something like Democrats. What political philosophers and people like me, when we use the word liberal, what we really mean is this notion of liberal as in believing in liberty and freedom, right? Do we believe in liberty and freedom? Then that's liberal, right? I'm not talking about American political pundits who go liberal versus conservative, where liberal merely means leftist, or left of center at least, right? Here, liberal means believing and subscribing to the value of liberty and freedom, right? A Bill of Rights, for example, is a liberal document that stipulates rights, liberties that all people shall have, yes? Now, with that in mind, what are the goals of equal treatment theory feminism? First is that there shall be, and there should be equal social and political opportunities. Equal social and political opportunities. That means all reasonable jobs should have equal access to men and to women. Yes, a woman should be a plumber just as a man should be a plumber. A man should be a school teacher just as much as a woman should be a school teacher. They should both have that equal opportunity to these different positions and these different sort of careers. There should also be equal opportunity to political office. So there should be an equal right for women to run for different political offices. Furthermore, the second principle that equal treatment feminism will put forward is that women should not be protected and isolated to say, oh, but a woman can't do that. They should be protected. They don't need to put themselves in harm's way in this way. So we are actually protecting women. A great example of this would be military personnel. For a long time, women were barred from military service in the United States. Now, women want to say, don't protect us. Okay? If we can have the equal opportunity to become military personnel and military soldiers, we shouldn't we have the right and the equal opportunity and the equal liberty to serve those sorts of functions, right? Don't protect us, so to speak. And that is going to be those two main tenets of equal treatment theory feminism, yes? A great proponent of equal theory feminism is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the late Supreme Court Justice, yes? She was a proponent of equal treatment theory. She would say things like men and women are equal in all the ways that matter legally. In all the ways that matter legally. Women should have equal access to every job, especially in the military, let's say, or political office, and things like this, right? Or being a police officer. All the differences that are there are simply social constructions, right? And as social constructions, we could change them, right? So, for example, today it so happens that many elementary school teachers, the far majority of elementary school teachers in America are women, right? Yes, but that doesn't have to be that way. We can change that. We can and probably should encourage men to become elementary school teachers. And it so happens that the majority of police officers are women, and we should change that. These are just social conventions that can be changed. We should open these sorts of jobs, police officers or military personnel, for example, to women, yes? And now, Ruth Bader Ginsburg isn't going to be absurd here and suggest there are no differences between men and women. Rather, what somebody like an equal treatment theory feminist would say is that the biological differences that do exist, when addressed by the law, they should face very high scrutiny. Very high scrutiny, right? And we should really pay attention to those so that we're not actually trying to protect women from from themselves or from society, right? Yes, there are going to be differences between men and women, but we should take a very, very careful look at such differences and make sure that we don't go overboard with protecting women, for example, yes? Now, what is a problem with equal treatment theory feminism? By the way, all philosophical ideas have problems, okay? So please don't suggest that this disproves this position, but rather this shows the challenges that equal theory feminists are going to have to address and work with and wrestle with within their own thinking, yes? So the first problem is that women only gain equality to the extent that they are actually similarly situated to men, right? And there are very significant differences. What about pregnancy? What about childbirth? What about menstruation? Right? How do we address equal treatment for those very, very significant differences, right? And equal theory feminism sometimes hits a wall on those kinds of questions. And that segues us very nicely into the second feminist theory. It's called cultural theory feminism, or sometimes difference theory feminism, right? And so what will difference theory, you can tell where we're going already, I hope, or cultural feminism, what will they suggest? Well, they will suggest that absolute or formal equalities don't always yield substantive equality, right? So, for example, if you say, yes, all women shall, and this is a rather abstract example, I hope you'll go with me here for a second, just because this is what I'm thinking of right now. But if you say, men and women shall run this race equally, right? Yes, they shall have the same equal starting line. However, we have in this race a woman who is 9 months pregnant. How can she be expected to run the race equal to other people, especially men, let's say, who never get pregnant? Well, that's going to be a very significant challenge, right? There are real differences between men and women, and we must accommodate, or we must account at least, and we must address those differences in order to achieve substantive equality, not merely formal equality of liberties, yes? Furthermore, if we are gender neutral in these sorts of things, right, we're actually not going to acknowledge the very significant differences that do exist between men and women according to difference theory feminism. Women shouldn't be treated the same when they are different. I like the example of pregnancy, for example, right? I think that's a great example. Do women really choose, for example, to leave their job when they become pregnant and to raise a family? That's an odd sort of choice, right? Because of certain biological necessities that entail that a woman cannot be at work, at least on the day that she gives childbirth, right? But of course, these difference theory feminists will go a step or two further, even more, right? Women shouldn't be expected to fit into male roles. Now, sometimes it's great. Yes, I think many difference theory feminists would love to see a female president, right? However, do we kind of see an issue when we ask women to become men, right? And that is a key point of contention for difference theory feminists. We don't want women to become men, right? We want to nurture certain feminine qualities that women have and encourage those feminine qualities, and furthermore build up equality such that those differences will be accounted for in our society. One key figure in this theory is Carol Gilligan. Carol Gilligan develops this idea called care ethics. And care ethics is going to be radically different from justice ethics. So many liberal philosophies that talk about liberties and freedoms, talk about what justice is. Well, yes, I've shared with you that I, for example, really love freedom of speech. I've grown up here in America, and I really like that First Amendment, freedom of speech. I shall have the freedom to speak. However, how does that account for, let's say, catcalling? Many people will say, oh, but I've got the freedom of speech to catcall you while you walk down the street. It's just speech. And Carol Gilligan would suggest, yes, perhaps when we're talking about justice, you're absolutely right. You have freedom of speech to catcall people when they walk down the street. However, there's more to life. There's more to society. There's more to values and living a good life, a good flourishing life. There's more to that than mere justice. There's also community and care. And so when you do catcall and you merely say, but I have my freedom of speech, you're missing the point. You're missing the point if you focus on your freedom of speech. Rather, why don't you try to be a more caring member of society and recognize that women feel uncomfortable, feel violated, feel like they're in danger when they are catcalled, right? And that's going to be the point of care ethics. That's the point of difference theory feminism, is that there are real differences and that we should account for these differences, and liberties and rights and justice isn't all there is when we're talking about values in society. Another great example that I like is maternity leave, right? Just think about this for a second. There's two people, George and a woman. The woman says, excuse me, boss, I want to take about a year off of work so I can give birth to my child because I think this is a meaningful aspect of life and an important aspect of life, and it contributes to a flourishing life. So I would like to take a year off of work, and I want to come back to work. I want that job waiting for me when I come back. Versus now, we'll have George now come in, and I say, excuse me, boss, let me tell you what I think a meaningful life is. I want to climb Mount Everest. So please give me a year off of work so I can go climb Mount Everest and achieve this lifelong goal that I've had all my life since childhood of scaling Mount Everest. And it'll take me about a year. And I'm going to come back though, and I want my job waiting for me when I come back. Now, I think it would be great if a boss did give me that sort of luxury. However, don't we recognize a difference between giving birth and raising a kid as a meaningful aspect of life versus climbing Mount Everest? I think they're both meaningful, but they're meaningful in very different ways. And should they be treated the same way? My inclination, and a difference theory feminist perhaps, might suggest that, well, George should be fired. Or at least, no, quit your job, fine, but we're not going to keep your job here waiting for you. Versus those of us who do believe that maternity leave is a good thing, and there are people in other civilized companies and other civilized parts of the world where they not only give maternity leave, but also paternity leave for the fathers to do the same, because this is a meaningful aspect of life, right? And it's, although climbing Mount Everest might also be meaningful, it's meaningful in a very different way, and it shouldn't be treated the same. Everybody's meaningful goals in life shouldn't be accommodated by their employers, for example, such that they get to quit their job for a year and come back. I think giving birth to a child and climbing Mount Everest are very different things. And that's going to be the whole point of difference theory feminists. So what is the key differences then between equal treatment feminism and difference theory feminism then? When does treating people differently, when does treating the sexes, men and women, differently, when does treating them differently hinder women? And that would be a consideration for equal theory feminists, equal treatment theory feminists. Let's look on the other side of that coin and ask this question. When does treating women and men the same hinder women? And by the way, even before maternity leave, it would seem very reasonable, justice-wise, to just fire a woman who wants to take off work to give birth. Because after all, hey, you're not showing up to, you want a year off? Get out of here. You're fired. Or you have to quit, right? And that seems to hinder women, especially women who do find that giving birth is important. And that isn't, by the way, motherhood, a very important part of life. Now then, what does that suggest then for difference theory feminism? That they want to foster a more communal notion of lawyering and justice and the justice system, right? As opposed to this adversarial aspect and this adversarial feature that especially the American legal system has, right? We should be more cooperative in our society. Now then, that said, are there problems with difference theory feminism? Of course there are. One is going to suggest that, wait, these differences don't really exist. There are no differences between women and men. That's an interesting sort of position to take. Furthermore, one that really hits me a little bit more is, doesn't this theory reinforce certain stereotypes of men and women, right? That women are more motherly, that women are more nurturing. So difference theory feminists have to address that sort of challenge. Doesn't this encourage the idea that such women need special protections, right? Well, difference theory feminists are going to have to address that problem. Now, the third feminist theory that Virchik and Levitt give us is called dominance theory feminism. And a key proponent of such dominance theory feminism is Catherine MacKinnon. Catherine MacKinnon and other dominance theory feminists are going to suggest, back to our original point, that men are privileged and women are subordinated in society, right? And this is encouraged. This subordination of women is actually encouraged by certain social institutions and cultural beliefs. And this is where dominance theory feminism is going to try to distinguish itself from equal theory feminism or difference theory feminism. Whereas they both talk about equivalence, right? That they do want to achieve some sort of equality. Dominance theory feminism is going to argue for the liberation of women from men. That seems to be a radically different goal, that they shall be liberated from men. That the patriarchy is a system of social practices and even political practices that really exploit women and subordinate them. This is done through force, social pressures, customs, and even legal institutions. There are very interesting examples to illustrate this point. Number one being the laws that are in place, right? Let's go back to classical liberals who believe in liberty and freedom. They believe in something called due process. That due process suggests that you, as a defendant, shall be presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, those sorts of claims are things that Catherine McKinnon is going to suggest help support the patriarchy. Because after all, doesn't that suggest that crimes against women, especially rape, are going to be very differently situated in the legal system? Number one, rape is very hard to prove. After all, if you have a female accuser who says, by the way, this person sexually violated me, sexually abused me, and then this person comes up, the man will say, no, it was all consensual. How do we prove beyond a reasonable doubt, right, this situation? And what dominance theory feminists will say is that the game is already rigged against the women, such that it's harder for women to address these sorts of situations, right? It's harder for women to prove this. Now, has society made certain advancements, right, with these sorts of crimes? Certainly. But there is still this, number one, presumed innocence of a rapist, right? Now, and then furthermore, this until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And if you merely have a he said, she said, doesn't that make it almost impossible to ever convict somebody of rape if it's merely she said versus he said? That shows that the game is already rigged against them. Now, how to address that? Well, that's a very complicated issue. That's going to be a very complicated issue that needs to be dealt with in a very complicated way. I don't have all the answers today, right? But that is something that Catherine McKinnon is going to say. This needs to be addressed. Furthermore, this shows that there is a dominant patriarchy that subordinates and exploits women and even gives them unequal access to justice, right? Or unfair, or dominated, or subordinate, rather. I think subordinate is a much better word than unequal. That gives women a subordinate access to justice. Women, of course, under dominance theory, women are second-class citizens. Both women and men are trained and indoctrinated into stereotypical cultural roles. So then, how shall women address this or challenge that sort of cultural and structural institutions and structural beliefs? Catherine McKinnon suggests that women should join women's only groups, right? They should join women's only groups. They should make themselves more visible as a woman's community. And of course, liberate themselves from the need of men to express their own displeasures and their own exploitation, and they could show the micro inequities that exist in society. What are some challenges or problems with such dominance theory feminism? Number one, it seems like it's condescending to certain women, such that if a certain woman says, I want to be a wife and I want to be a mother, traditional roles, to traditional womanly roles, doesn't dominance theory feminism suggest that they're being brainwashed, that they're not thinking properly, right? That they are being oppressed, they just don't know it, right? And that is a serious attack against dominance theory feminism. Furthermore, it devalues the role of motherhood, right? We recognized in the last group, difference theory feminism or cultural feminism, or the care ethics feminism, that motherhood is a very important part of life, and it's part of a flourishing life. Doesn't it devalue that sort of role? Now, this is a nice segue to our next one, which is this third problem of dominance theory feminism, is it seems to universalize the experience of white women, right? To be a proper dominance theory feminist, you have to be like typical white women and liberate yourself in certain ways. Okay, that's a nice segue into our next theory, our fourth theory of feminism, and this is called critical race feminism. And the key idea behind critical race feminism is that traditional feminism has typically focused on the needs of privileged white women. And they make these mistakes of feminist essentialism. What does that mean? It means that in order to really understand the oppressed woman's position, shouldn't we better understand those in the positions on the margins, not in the center, but those who are really deeply and terribly oppressed. For example, black women. They've ignored this essential feature of intersectionality such that racism and sexism are typically intertwined, and that they double up the oppression that is felt by black women, let's say. Women, and not just women, but all individuals have multiple consciousnesses. People are not just women and men, but people are also black and white, or a mother, or not a mother, or single, or married, or homosexual, or straight, right? There are many different identities that do play a role, and it's not just this single women's feminism that we should be focused on, but rather this notion of critical race feminism, which recognizes the intersectionality between all sorts of multiple identity consciousnesses that all of us have, really. Rather, what we need to address these issues is to have a more empathetic understanding of those who are most oppressed. We need to hear more stories, more perspective from those in those severely oppressed groups, especially those who are doubly and triply oppressed vis-a-vis their multiple identifying consciousnesses. If we recall from critical legal studies, where we be reminded that laws and institutions as they're written are not neutral. Rather, they frame and they create the society that we have, such that, the critical race feminists will suggest, such that laws are in place that, number one, oppress women, number two, also oppress racial minorities, and thus triply oppress racially minority women. For example, free speech, right? Again, something that I really enjoy, but this is a problem that I have to address now, is, yeah, I love free speech. However, how do I address the notions of hate speech? How does the notion of free speech actually maintain the status quo of oppressing certain classes of people? Especially when I say, oh, freedom of speech means that hate speech shall be allowed too. Well, now I'm recognizing certain challenges that my own beliefs have that I'm going to have to address now. But for those of us who do value freedom of speech, how do we address things like hate speech, especially in light of the fact that it does contribute to the oppression of so many people, and yet it's allowed under the guise of free speech? Certain critical race feminists will suggest, like Richard Delgado does, that people shall tell stories to help increase empathy around society, increase understanding of those severely oppressed people in our society. The fifth style of feminism, the fifth feminist theory that Virchik and Levitt give us, is called lesbian feminism. They call it lesbian feminism. And what they're going to say is very similar to the critical race feminists. And they're going to challenge traditional feminists in suggesting that, wait, isn't traditional feminism straight woman feminism? What about the doubly oppressed class of homosexual women or lesbian women? There isn't, in fact, a universal feminine experience. So feminism ought not to essentialize womanness or womanhood, because there are so many different ways to be a woman, right? So just like men oppress women, what these lesbian feminists will suggest is that in the same way, straight women oppress lesbian women and homosexual women, right? So even within this oppressed class, there's further oppression happening. And furthermore, lesbian feminists have radically different interests than straight feminists. After all, being straight, women are afforded, and I like this stat that Levitt and Virchik give us, straight women are afforded at least 1,049 benefits in virtue of marriage that homosexuals cannot gain. Now, this article is a little bit old, but since 2015, when the Supreme Court struck down laws against homosexual marriage. Now, many lesbian feminists and many lesbians and homosexuals of all stripes can enjoy those benefits of marriage. However, now, in the year 2021, we see an emerging group in the LGBTQ community suggesting, wait a second, there's a different way to be a woman, transgender women. And there are a lot of oppressions that are afforded. Certainly homosexual women are still oppressed in uniquely homosexual ways. However, shouldn't we recognize that now transgender women are being oppressed in very certain ways too, very specific ways? And in light of the fact that there isn't an essential way to be a woman, shouldn't we recognize how the legal structure is working to oppress such people? Shouldn't we change the legal structure to afford certain protections to such people? Now, there is something of a debate. What about the biological nature? What about the biological nature of homosexuality? Well, there's two ways to go about this, right? One, either homosexuality does have a biological and genetic cause, or it doesn't. However, to some people, like me, I don't think it matters either way. Because either, number one, it is biological, then we should make accommodations to support and stop the oppression of such people in the same way that certain other biological features, like the color of one's skin, are protected in legal ways, right? Or rather, oppression against certain biological features are protected in legal ways. Or let's look at the other hand. Let's suggest that for a quick second that homosexuality is not biologically caused or genetically caused. Well then, why don't we just treat it like we treat other irrelevant beliefs? Irrelevant in the terms of legal standing, such as religious beliefs, right? We, as a society, have decided that religious beliefs, whatever your religious beliefs are, and by the way, many of us will have some sort of choice, and they're not necessarily biological, right? Religious beliefs are not biological in origin, yet in many cases, religious beliefs are irrelevant in front of the law, such that you cannot discriminate in terms of somebody's religious beliefs. And so, even if homosexuality were not biological in origin, then why don't we just put it in that category like religious beliefs, such that you shouldn't be able to discriminate against it because it's irrelevant anyways. Now, let's move on to the sixth feminist theory that Virchik and Levitt give us. Eco-feminism, right? What these eco-feminist theorists will suggest is that there's intersections between human oppression and environmental oppression. In the same way that men oppress the environment and use and manipulate the environment for their own purposes, men also manipulate and oppress women for their own purposes, right? And we could see many parallels in this, so eco-feminist theorists suggest. That's because in our culture, it is that the masculine is equated with the mind, and the feminine is equated with nature. The core idea here with the ecofeminists is that feminine oppression echoes and parallels environmental destruction and environmental pollution in so many ways, such that this is ours to use. Who cares about protecting the environment? It's ours to use. Who cares about protecting women? It's ours to use. And so we want to, and we should, identify certain ways that environmental oppression and feminine oppression is connected with social and environmental factors. They like to point out it's not a coincidence that many environmental activists are in fact women. So we can draw these connections between contamination and discrimination. The seventh feminist theory that Levitt and Virchik give us is called pragmatic feminism, right? And they are using this word from the late 19th century, early 20th century American pragmatic philosophers, such that they're going to say there is not one single solution to all of these myriad problems that are before us. What does that mean? That means truths are usually incomplete. Truths are very open to change, aren't they? The world is open to change. So abstract concepts like liberty and justice and rights, they don't always help us solve real world problems right now. Right? There are real problems. And just saying, oh, but there's equal rights, isn't always the best solution. Instead of striving for universal goals, we should stress the importance of context and perspective to help us understand so many different and diverse problems that are ahead of us, that are in front of us. For example, the example that I like going to a lot is free speech. I say free speech, and then there's people who complain about catcalling. Oh, but free speech. Well, talking about free speech isn't really dealing with the problem, is it? The problem is that there are certain women who feel violated and feel endangered and feel unsafe as a result of catcalling. And as a result, merely saying that George has free speech, that's not solving any problem, really. How do we solve the problem? We have to look at it in a more circumstantial way. This is a circumstance here. Let's look at the context and all the environmental factors and social factors that play into this particular problem. Now, with this problem about lower wages, it's not about free speech and liberty anymore. We have to talk about other sorts of issues, such that we want to increase the amount of money, let's say, that women are able to earn in society. And we're not going to deal with wage issues in the same way that we deal with catcalling issues, right? Sometimes we want to talk about liberty. Sometimes we want to talk about other sorts of things. There are, of course, problems that come up with such pragmatic theories. Number one is it's too uncertain. There's no real commitments to any solutions. There's an unclear morality, right? And it might work right now, but these changes might not have a long-term effect. What is a pragmatic feminist going to respond? You're absolutely right. Why? Because the world changes. Things change. Circumstances change. Events change. Attitudes change. And so why should a solution that worked yesterday, why should we expect that solution from the past to work in the future? The world is a different place today. We have to evolve. So the pragmatic feminist will suggest. Now, the eighth and final feminist theory group that Levitt and Burchick bring up is called postmodern feminism. Now, postmodern feminism is going to go in a slightly different direction than we've been discussing so far. Number one, they are going to suggest harmony is impossible. Harmony is just impossible. Truth is a figment of your imagination. We postmodernists should reject style and form, right? We reject objective knowledge. What you think is knowledge is merely belief, is merely what you believe. There is no such thing as knowledge. This, of course, has been influenced by the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. What they want to suggest, rather, is instead of looking at answers and knowledge and focusing on real goals, we should really focus upon revealing the power structures in society that are hidden from all of us, that we can't really see, that we don't really notice because we've been so ingrained. There are always going to be hidden political messages and biases that are underlying, and hidden assumptions that are underlying our political system. Why don't we recognize those? What there is power. And those people in power want to maintain their power. And what are they doing to maintain their power? And so what would a postmodernist suggest? That they want to identify those power structures so that the people without power can flip this situation upside down. What they really want to do is identify all these cultural norms and beliefs and institutions and social structures that we really take for granted, right? And identify how these hierarchies are maintained in society. Laws, remember, are not objective or neutral. They're always filled with all sorts of biases. What the postmodernists want to say is, let's identify those biases. Now, what are some problems with such postmodernism? Well, they might suggest that it's not really liberating or effective because they don't really have any real goals. There is no morality here after all, right? There are no morals or goals. So this notion of going towards equality, why equality? There is no such thing as equality, right? There's no such thing as justice. Therefore, there's no such thing as injustice. That seems to be a problem for some thinkers. It's way too abstract, a lot of thinkers say, that such postmodern ideas are way too abstract to be effective. And there's nothing to show in this postmodern framework what equality or democracy should actually look like. My hunch is they would say, we don't care about equality or democracy, right? There is no should, there is no morality in such postmodernism. Rather, let's just upend the power structures and reveal the hidden assumptions within these power structures. So I hope that summary of feminist ideas, these 8 different feminist schools, show us how diverse feminist ideas really are and how we might engage with so many different feminist problems of womanhood, problems that feminists identify, right? And as a matter of fact, this doesn't show that feminism is fractured, but rather shows that feminism is a very strong set of beliefs such that we could identify so many problems in a very different ways. And each of these schools, it seems to me, really reveals different insights that we have to address in our society, yeah? See you next time. Bye-bye.